Do you know, when we come to Revelation chapter 11, when I first read this chapter, I thought, what on earth does this mean? I just thought, how am I ever going to understand this? Let alone how am I going to understand it? How am I ever going to try and explain it to anybody else? How am I going to stand before a camera and actually trying to explain what this is all about? It's dense and tricky stuff. But the more I've studied it, with the help of great commentaries, and I've got to say, this guy, Tim Chester, Revelation View, I found this really helpful, and I've stolen most of what he says to try and understand this chapter. We need help because this is dense stuff. And not only that, it's stuff that actually so many of us tend to take literally, whereas the more I've understood it, the more I've read people like Tim Chester, the more I've realised we are to see his symbol. We're to see that some of the things that John's saying points to a bigger picture. And a lot of what we read in this chapter, chapter 11, actually is based completely on the Old Testament. If we're going to get our heads around it, we shouldn't be trying to take this literally, but asking, what do the symbols mean? Where do they come from? What's he trying to say? We start this chapter by coming across two witnesses who are given a measuring rod and told to go and measure the temple of God, the altar, and its worshippers. Now, two places in the Old Testament we come across a similar picture of someone measuring God's temple. The first is in the book of Ezekiel. Now, the temple that Ezekiel measures never gets built. It's like a picture of something to come in the future. In Zechariah is given a measuring rod and told to go and measure the city of Jerusalem. Now, what's all this about? Well, to me, the symbolism here, and thanks to people like Tim Chester, isn't actually pointing to the building of a physical temple. It's a picture pointing forward to the time when God would build his living temple. We're given a picture here about God's plans to build a new temple of living stones. He's talking about the building of the church. And the church, of course, is us. We are that temple. And a temple that has a point and a purpose. Now next, from verse 3 onwards, he starts talking about two witnesses. And we might ask ourselves, well, who are these two witnesses? They are kind of royal and priestly witnesses. Now, you'll know from the Old Testament that for someone to be taken to court, there needs to be more than one witness. One witness might be biased. There needs to be two witnesses. This is the minimum requirement. And here these witnesses represent two things, royalty and priesthood. You see, in the Old Testament, those two figures prefigure the role of the church. We are to be a kingdom, a royal kingdom of priests. We have that job to represent God to the world, and we have that job of bringing God's rule to the earth. But these witnesses also have a prophetic role, and if you read this chapter, you'll see a hint here, a reminder of two of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. Who are they? Moses and Elijah. People called by God to speak against situations where the world had turned against God's rule. See, that's what the church is called to be and to do. We are to be God's witnesses, to speak to the world, to speak fiery judgment. These guys that do just that. We are supposed to warn people, not literally with fire, but we are to warn people that they need to turn back to God. Because the way that people live against God, it will not do forever. Now, we read further on in the chapter that the world turns against these witnesses. It's a coded message that the world will not like what the church has to say. And eventually, some will actually lose their lives because they refuse to bow the knee. And we get pictures here of empires too. We have pictures that remind us of the empires of Egypt and Babylon. What was the empire of it? Down here, the game away there. What was the empire of John's day that was actually punishing, killing Christians for speaking out a word against the emperor? Well, Rome. The empire that caused Christ to be put to death on a cross. Rome is the empire that actually John is critiquing and saying that yes, there will be a time when Rome will be allowed to have its way. Christians will perish. But ultimately we will prevail. That 42 months period remind us that yes, God will allow things to go against us, but ultimately we will find our place before God, secure for all eternity. So the question for us today is, what are the empires, what are the powers that are coming against us? And will we stand? Will we remain faithful to the end? We'll hear more about chapter 11 tomorrow.